All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the presentation this morning. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the folks that you're seeing on the screen here. First, my name is Doug Herman. I'm a partner with BDO and run the Forensic Technology Services practice. I tend to be involved in the highly technical, unfortunate instances where there is a breach. So in the best of times, you don't usually interact with me. Also with me today is Jason Crow, who's a cybersecurity attorney at Miller Johnson. I also have Mr. Sam Rao, who's a technical services manager with Microvisions Incorporated. And then last but not least, I have Eric Shirk, who's a partner also in the Forensic Technology Services practice here at BDO. With that said, Jason, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Doug. So today's presentation is when life's a breach, preparedness is the best response. So I've got, I don't know, 60 slides here, 70 slides here, and we're gonna spend, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes on each slide. So I hope everybody can buckle up and get ready to be inundated with tons of information. No, we're gonna hopefully, today's format is, like Doug said, gonna be a lot of Q&A, and hopefully what I can do is set the stage for everybody with some good raw data about what's happening in the data breach cybersecurity space. And then once we kind of set a baseline of data, we can talk about how to mitigate some of the risk related to cybersecurity and data breaches. Without further ado, I would be remiss if I didn't give the the disclaimer here. So I am a cybersecurity attorney at Miller Johnson. I previously practiced at a firm that's based in Chicago, near where Doug at BDO operates. And now I'm here at Miller Johnson. I am a cybersecurity attorney, but this is not legal advice. So, what we're going to be talking about today is cybersecurity risk and the risk associated with data breaches and in this interconnected world. So we're gonna talk about that problem, and then we're also going to talk about a solution that Miller Johnson and Microvisions is a managed service IT provider, put together to try to take cybersecurity, compliance, and insurance and simplify the whole process. I think any presentation about the internet and about data security should start with memes, especially now we've got the GameStop and AMC, what they're calling stock memes. And so show me the data. And that's actually where I like to start. I've done, I don't know, 50 of these, it feels like, and that's where I always like to start. So where do we get our data? I presented in front of the West Michigan Cybersecurity Consortium, which is a consortium of all the best cybersecurity practitioners in town, all the CISOs and whatnot. And I asked them, I said, where do you get your data? And most of them responded here, which is the IBM report. For a lot of folks on this presentation, you'll probably be familiar with it. Another place that everyone said was, there was, I don't know, 150 people there. They said the data breach investigations report from Verizon. I took a look at both for this presentation, the most recent ones. And, when I took a look at Verizon, I saw a lot of this and I didn't really know what to do with it. So I moved on and I started to look at the Verizon. So the IBM report, which has been now put out for many, many years. So the IBM report is the one I like to look at, and my colleagues tend to refer to. And so this data that we're going to take a look at is from 3,200 separate interviews with individuals at 524 organizations that suffered a data breach between August 2019 and April 2020. So that's how they collected the data. The data breach examined in the 2020 ranged in size between 3,400 and 999,000 compromised records. And so the reason I want to point this out is, the data you're about to see is going to look like all related to what they call like mega breaches, which are these huge breaches like the Target breach or the Equifax breach, which is, kind of skews the numbers. But really, they try to focus in data breaches that I think would be relevant to this audience. So, this is the average cost of a data breach, according to them, 7 million. It says 80% of share breaches included customer PII at an average cost of $150 per record. 5 million was the average total cost of a breach at enterprises of more than 25,000 employees. So those are big numbers, but in West Michigan at Miller Johnson, where I practice, and my clients in West Michigan, we get 30 data breaches a year, it seems like, maybe more. And not all of them cost millions of dollars. In fact, I've only had a couple that have exceeded the $1 million mark. That may be for a number of reasons, but we find the average run-of-the-mill data breach that we're handling these days is usually like a $50,000 to $150,000 price point, and then punctuated in there are your $500,000, $700,000 breaches. So what type of records are compromised? Customer PII, intellectual property. We see that customer PII is 80%, shows up in 80% of the data breaches in each category. Then down at the bottom, you see employee PII. Even though that's only 21%, I feel like that's ends up being a large number of the data breaches that I work on. Then you've got other corporate data is 23%. So that's the type of data that's being compromised. So here's where the cost of data breaches come in. They say, 39% is to lost business cost. 28% is to detection and escalation. 6% to notification, and 25% to ex post response. And so, it's kind of split in my mind a little bit evenly between lost business and data breach response. And the way that they determine lost business is they look at customer churn. So how they attribute an amount of money to the number of lost customers, and that's how they determine lost business. And that can come from a ransomware attack shutting down your company for 2 or 3 days, right? So average total cost of a data breach by organizational size. If you look over here to the left, less than 500 employees. Those are oftentimes the the size of organizations that I'm dealing with. You can see it over here. There we go. And you're at, so the average total cost here for the smaller organizations it ranges in the $2.3 million range, which, like I said, at least from my experience, if you're at a larger firm in a national market, or at a national firm in a larger market, say Chicago, these are probably the size of breaches that you're working on, oftentimes. So this is an important slide. So what's the cause of data breaches according to the good data, right? So here we've got 23% is human error, 52% is malicious attack, and then 25% is system glitch. And I actually think this slide is a little bit misleading if you kind of pull back the layers of the onion. And the reason I say that, and Eric and Sam or Doug may agree or disagree, but what I see in this slide is actually about 75% human error. And even system glitch. If you look at this slide, I think system glitch could probably be boiled down in large part to human error. So, system glitch, I'm thinking of like, in some respects, like, failure to turn on patching. Is that a system glitch or is that human error? I think it might be a little bit of both. Malicious attack implies criminals, right? And criminals are humans. And so, to me, what I would put out there, what this slide seems to tell me, and my experience tells me, is that human error, or humans, generally speaking, are the cause of data breaches. And so when people, come to me, I'm a cybersecurity attorney, and they say, oh, I need an IT stack. That's all I need. I just need more IT, more IT, more IT. No offense, Sam. Just give me more IT and more managed services provider. I say, well, that's going to probably help, but it's not going to solve everything. Why? Because of this slide. So this may be one of the most important slides that you see today, if not the most important slide.
Jason, we got a question from the audience that I think probably is very pertinent to your human error conversation. I'm going to direct this one to Eric. So, Eric, given that a lot of breach originates based on human error and stuff like that, I have to imagine that with all of us working from home these days, there's going to be some impact, right? So we're no longer behind the firewalls of the companies we work for and stuff along those lines. We may be using our own personal computers versus a work laptop or something like that. Eric, can you talk about the impact of remote working on cyber?
I'll touch on a couple of points and expand, I think, on what Doug talked about. So first, our home networks are rarely going to be defended and monitored like our work networks, right? This is, I think, makes sense to everyone, but when you really lean back in your chair and you think about it, is wow, you are working and accessing corporate assets likely through the same network that your family's using to surf social media, to go to websites. There's not the typical blocking of websites that may be deemed high risk on home networks typically. So that's the first thing to kind of think about. Secondly, remote workforces. I mean, we were all thrown, because of COVID, we were all thrown into many times working in a remote situation, not at the scale that was ever anticipated from our policies and procedures perspective, right? It really, with the flip of a switch, many of us were pushed primarily from working inside of a corporate firewall to our home networks, and maybe on assets, endpoints, desktops and laptops that are not corporate hardened, that are not monitored by and patched by corporate virus, malware protection, and those types of things. And I will say too, I find employees are probably likely more distracted when they're working from home. And then as such, probably more vulnerable to phishing attacks. I think we've got, the FedEx guys showing up at the door, the kids are home from school, other spouses, partners may be home as well. So it's just a very much, I think, a more chaotic, distracted environment. So those are a few things that come to mind.
Yeah, and if I may throw it in there too, Jason mentioned that oftentimes a lot of IT is just thrown at the stack. More firewall, more antivirus, more patching. In the remote workforce, a lot of that is taken away, as Eric mentioned. So the importance of that user error and training on how to handle that becomes more and more prevalent as people become more remote. We have less tools to help combat that human error on a day-to-day basis.
No, I think that's right. And, Eric, to your point, the reason why I had to get up at the beginning of this presentation and shut my door completely was because I have a new puppy. And I figured there would be no better time than on this presentation for my puppy to come in and poke his head in. So that's right. So, if we look at this slide too, they kind of break down the root causes by threat vector. And, you've got, 20% is compromised credentials, 20% is cloud misconfiguration, which is interesting. That's a very tech kind of root cause. But phishing is a human thing. Malicious insider is a human thing. Business email compromise is generally a human thing. It's often, after a phishing attack, there's been a business, they enter in their business email email credentials, and then it's compromised. So, so what's interesting, and here's one of the takeaways that IBM had that I thought I would highlight, that it says a majority of malicious breaches were caused by compromised credentials, cloud misconfiguration, or third-party software vulnerability. So, that's what the bad guys are doing, right? And that resonates. That's consistent with my experience as well. When my clients call and they say, we've had a data security incident, 9 times out of 10, they're going to tell me that it's compromised credentials or a third-party software vulnerability. I haven't had too many of these cloud misconfiguration breaches. I don't know, Doug or Eric, if you
We
guys
have.
had those.
Yeah, we have.
What do they mean by that?
Well, look, there's a little bit of a notion out there is that I'll manage cybersecurity risk by just assigning a third party to it. Well, guess what? Sometimes those systems are not configured correctly as well. So, I mean, as you think of, well, I really love this graph. And the reason being is it really kind of brews down that almost 3/4 of my risk are in 4 categories. Compromised credentials and phishing, in my eyes, are very highly related. I put this in a bucket of one of my employees clicked a phishing email, hit a link, got suckered into entering email credentials, making it think that it was a corporate enterprise email system and not necessarily, a bogus one, and provided their credentials to them. The cloud misconfiguration is back to what you said earlier, Jason, highly tied to human error. These are very complex systems, whether they're on-premise and inside my firewall or in the cloud. They are very complicated, and it really requires teams of individuals to appropriately configure and anticipate the vulnerabilities and close those vulnerabilities. I'll also be honest, a lot of organizations don't test on an annual basis. There's the concept of annual vulnerability and penetration testing. A lot of people don't do it. They place a lot of trust and a lot of faith in a very few people. And it's a very difficult job to keep track of as far as all these disparate systems, how they're different, how they communicate with one another. Very, very, very complicated. Third-party vulnerability and third-party software, patch management, right? How often do we step into, I just wrapped up an investigation where it was actually with an MSP. So when you talk about organizations subcontracting their IT infrastructure at some level to an MSP, that MSP provider was running on a 2008 operating system that hadn't been patched in over a year and a half. So vulnerability in third-party software is patch management. So really, I like this graph because 3/4 of your risk are falling in these little buckets. And then if you actually have some just basic defenses to these, you can remediate a lot of your risk to your typical small and mid-sized organizations.
So Eric, I think you raised some really good points there. Sam, can I ask you to jump in, because you're on the other side of that coin, right? We're trying not to make fun of you here, or at least Eric wasn't, I don't think. But at the same time, I mean, you boots on the ground for an MSP. Can you talk to the audience a little bit about how you deal with this?
Yeah, so MSPs have been a huge target over the past couple of years now. We have our hands in a lot of different systems, and a lot of trust is put there. So we have to be extremely diligent in how we handle our internal data as well as our customer data. So it's been a huge shift over the past couple of years of being extremely security focused. The benefit we have of that is we can look at ourselves and see what vulnerabilities we have or don't have, and then help our clients to understand it as well and the importance behind it. So it's been a huge shift, and we've had the opportunity to partner with Eric and Jason and the rest to understand what that actually means. We're seeing a lot of industry compliance, as we'll talk about a little bit more later. A lot of industry compliance and a lot of government compliance coming down the line, and MSPs are no exception to that. So I think over the next year and a half, if an MSP is not stepping up and getting into the security game, they're going to find themselves falling far, far behind.
Sam, can I ask you an unrelated follow-on question that we received from the group here? So it sort of harkens back to what we talked about a little bit ago about, people being a potential vulnerability. But one of the folks on the presentation here asked about the remote use of Outlook without VPN. Can you sort of talk about some of the risks associated with that, or how to properly manage those risks?
Yeah, so anytime you have a remote workforce, a VPN is going to help secure that in any way. Outlook is no exception. Like we've discussed, home networks do not have the resources that a corporate network will have for putting those IT stacks in place, for putting the security functions in place. And those VPNs help channel all of that traffic directly to your organization and basically segment them from the other entities on your local home network, your Nest thermostats and Minecraft servers that are running for your kids, things of that sort. So with the VPN, you're channeling your data through to your corporate network and segmenting yourself off in that way. So I would always recommend having one in any case possible.
Sam, Doug, sorry, I want to jump in. Sam, can you also talk about MFA and the importance of MFA? I mean, I'm constantly pulling my hair out, typically on the reactive side when we're doing investigations about organizations still not using MFA and what a risk that is, presents. And it's really a simple process to really remediate that. I was wondering if you can just talk briefly about that.
Absolutely. On one of the previous slides, we looked at compromised credentials as being one of the biggest hits that cause these breaches. What MFA will do for you is add that extra layer of protection to your username, to your password, so that
what's MFA, Sam?
I'm sorry, yeah, multi-factor authentication.
Oh,
so
wow.
that's those rolling codes that you see, those 6-digit codes you have to type in when you enter a website, or the text messages that you get, which I don't recommend the text message route, but or the yes/no exception that you would get as a prompt on your cell phone to allow you. And that's the most common method of multi-factor authentication, which basically the idea is you have multiple pieces of data required in order to log in. So you have a password, your username, and you have something in your possession, that rolling code or a security key or your fingerprint, something of that sort. And it's required almost nowadays to pass any kind of security compliance and vulnerability compliance.
So Sam, it's interesting that you mentioned MFA because that is, obviously a really great way to secure things. I actually had the privilege of sitting in on a webinar yesterday where people were talking about, well, hey, look, my iPhone does, face scan, or, eventually they're going to be doing retina scans and things along those lines. And frankly, the commentary back was, I would still prefer MFA that sends me a text message because you only have one face and you only have one retina. So if that ever somehow gets out there into the marketplace, there's nothing you can do to change it. So I thought that was an interesting comment associated with MFA. One more question that just came in from the audience. I'm going to read it directly, and then I'll let whoever thinks is best to respond. If my business's client information is stored in a third-party cloud server, and the third-party server is breached, who is liable for the information that is breached? Notification costs, the forensic IT work, the monitoring, etc.
So as a cybersecurity lawyer, I end up being what cyber insurance calls like the data breach coach. It's sort of, guiding a company through how to best respond to a data breach from an IT perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from an insurance perspective, all of those things. And part of that is in the first phone call, what we'll do is we'll say, okay, where's the data? And what data do you think was compromised? And they say, well, it's our client data, but it's hosted by this third-party service provider. And so, we don't have it. And, that system's been breached. And so we're fine. It's all on them to deal with it. Well, the way that data privacy laws and compliance things have developed over the years is that even if you have a third-party service provider hosting your data and providing services to you, the organization that collects the data from the consumer or from business to business, they're kind of the owner of the data. And all of the obligations arise under these laws. All of the obligations are imposed on the data owner. So, the data owner ultimately, really is a lot of time, I mean, responsible. However, the third-party service provider may be so embarrassed or so distraught in trying to save business, save face, they may end up taking over the whole data breach response, right? They may end up hiring the IT person, paying for it to run the forensic investigation. They may end up paying for the third-party vendor to send out notifications. They may pay for a regulatory response. However, you know, if you're the organization that is collecting the data for your business purpose, you own it. And as the owner, you know, the obligations arise for, you know, it's your obligation to protect it, to notify folks. And all the laws, the patchwork of laws that are out there, you know, they address them a little bit differently every time. And they put obligations on the third-party service provider to actually notify the owner. So like in Europe, they call it, under the GDPR, they call it the data controller and the data processor. You know, here we might call it the data owner and the third-party service provider, or the licensee and the license, you know. And so that's kind of how the system works, you know, from a legal perspective. And then from a practical perspective, sometimes, you know, like I said, it's just the third-party service provider that's picking up the tab.
Jason may kill me for saying this, but I think it also stresses the importance of Cyber Counsel reviewing contracts for third parties. Those third-party agreements will obviously be crafted. They'll be skewed towards the service provider. But having someone with that forethought of the wheels come off the bus and things get a little hairy and there's costs that need to be accounted for, having somebody with that perspective review those contracts, I typically find is super helpful.
Yeah. Guys, we've got a couple more great questions that have come in on the topic of, you know, who's ultimately responsible for data breach. So regarding ownership of the data breach, for clarity, should our payroll provider be compromised? Is it up to our company to notify those impacted, or is it up to the payroll provider?
Without providing legal advice, I think the short answer is the company. You know, and and thank you, Eric. You may have, you know, I may be getting phone calls later today from folks asking for legal review, so I can pay for my puppy's vet bills and stuff. But you know, it really, I mean, once a breach happens, you know, going back to this data breach coach idea, Doug, is, you know, we sit down and we walk through the same analysis that people are asking these questions about. We say, okay, you know, I guess we start with the baseline assumption that the company itself owns the data, regardless of where it's sitting, how it was collected, who collected it. And then we walk through, you know, kind of the contractual obligations that arise, right? So, you know, if you have ADP, your contract with ADP is probably going to, you know, point in several directions. It's going to, you know, there may be the payroll provider may have all these provisions that say, okay, in the event of a breach, this is what we're going to do. In the event of a data security incident, this is what we're going to do. And then once we determine that it's actually a breach, because breach has its own meaning under the law and under contract, and they could be slightly different, and they're slightly different all over the country too. And under federal law, you know, data breach, what is it? Cybersecurity event. We're going to talk about that. You know, once you have an incident, that's kind of step one, and then you figure out, okay, who's got the responsibility for what? And you know, one of the first things we say, or we always say, is call your attorney to wrap it all up in attorney-client privilege. And then we'll talk to you about reaching out to, you know, notifying your cyber liability insurance policy, getting that started right away. Because guess what? They're going to have approved vendors, approved lawyers, approved forensic IT folks. And, you know, if you like your own attorney that you already have, and you like your own forensic IT folks that you already have, you can get those folks approved. But you're going to have to, you know, notify insurance. And then you're going to, you know, you're going to have to look through your contracts. And then it's going to be about, you know, about portioning the responsibility and the liability among the parties that are involved. And it becomes a little bit of a, you know, kind of on-the-spot negotiation in some respects. But the bottom line is that the data owner, the obligations always kind of fall back on the data owner. Now, the data owner, if they don't get notice from the third-party service provider that an incident has happened, they can't do anything, right? So the law does provide obligations. The contracts that you have with your third-party service providers do provide obligations on those third-party service providers to provide the data owner notice and to do certain things. But ultimately, it falls on the owner to take care of the notice and make sure it happens, kind of regardless of who ultimately does it.
Another really great question came up about MFA. Sam, I'm going to address this one to you. So, Sam, when you were talking about the best use of MFA, we were sort of talking about a scenario where the multi-factor would be you get a text message to your phone or something along those lines that you have to type in addition to your credentials. Sam, what options do organizations have that maybe have employees that don't have phones or don't have phones that can receive text messages?
There's a lot of other options out there, some of them better than others. There are some services that will allow a voice phone call authorization to a landline or something of that effect. There's also a lot of manufacturers that'll make USB keys that you plug into your computer. There's a button on it you hit, and that sends the code through. That's a pretty common one as well, or a smart card. So there are other options out there, and that's actually a pretty common hurdle that we have to cross when implementing multi-factor for our clients. Is a lot of them don't have acceptable use policies or mobile device policies that accommodate that requirement, where the policy will state that any employee that uses a piece of technology, the company has they require the user to have a multi-factor program on their cell phone, even if it's personally owned. We run into that hurdle quite a bit, and that's something that we've basically had to guide our clients through figuring out how to implement.
Jason, I want to redirect a subpart to this question. So I saw this question come in, and I glanced down on my computer and saw that, oh yeah, that's right, there's the fingerprint reader. Now, Jason, I don't want to go into the whole world of, should you be collecting biometric data? Please don't go there. But at the same time, I mean, technically this fingerprint reader that's sitting on my ThinkPad, that would be multi-factor, wouldn't it? Do you advise potentially using that?
Lawyer answer, yes and no. I mean, I believe in data minimization. So, whenever I advise clients, I think some of the best legal advice I've given to clients is don't collect it. And, when you start getting into biometric data, regardless of whether you're using it for 2FA or MFA or for some other reason, you've introduced a whole new data point that, in fact, Illinois has its own law specific to regulating, biometric data. And, it's in fact, there was a data breach in March of 2020 related to biometric data. The Antheus Technologia biometric data breach.
So Jason, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left for this section of the presentation before we move on. Do you want me to turn it back over to you, and you can kind of select the slides that make sense? Admittedly, these questions coming in are awesome, so we'll keep answering them, but wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Here's the type of costs that you're gonna have post data breach. So, consulting and legal services are actually going to probably be like 10 to 20% of the cost of the consulting. It's all going to be wrapped up in the forensic response, because what happens post data breach is you get an IT company to come in and actually tell the lawyers what happened, whether there was access or acquisition of regulated data. And so that becomes the question. And a lot of these laws, almost all of them, boil down to whether there was access or acquisition. There's a new law in Michigan that also talks about disruption or misuse, and we'll get to that new law in a minute. But the new law in Michigan talks about a cybersecurity event as an event that results in an unauthorized access to, an acquisition of, or disruption or misuse of an information system or non-public information stored on an information system. So I find and there's this law was based on, I think there's 13 or 14 laws like it in the country right now. I find the disruption or misuse to be a little bit alarming, because it's like, that means any type of attack could give rise to an event that could give rise to notification obligations or regulatory oversight or regulatory fines. So it is interesting that they added disruption or misuse. But so cyber insurance most often covered the cost of third-party services and victim restitution. So this was the takeaway that the IBM report said. So if you had a data breach, how do you pay for it? And what are the costs? Here are the costs: consulting, legal services, regulatory fines, recovery technology, ransomware, extortion, and cyber insurance most often pays for the third-party services and the victim restitution. So here's a Acme Insurance Company insurance policy. We recommend, in the first call with a client that's trying to create an information security program for their company, I say some basic things. One of the basic things is just get cyber risk insurance. It's not expensive anymore, and you can get a lot for your money. Here's what they're going to ask you oftentimes in your standard insurance policy about what the company has in terms of network security controls. And this goes back to what Eric and Sam were talking about a lot today, which is, do you have the firewall? Do you have updated antivirus? Do you have an intrusion detection system? Do you have a data loss prevention system? Do you have multi-factor? You can see it in H down there. They want to know, insurance wants to know these things, because they know it's going to impact whether a breach is going to be, because you're going to have a breach, whether a breach is going to be a costly breach, or I should say a data security incident, whether a data security incident is going to rise to the level of a breach, or not. It's going to be determined somewhat in part due to whether you have these or not. So here's more of an insurance questionnaire. Here's the privacy controls. This is where I come in a lot of times and talk to folks about having a chief privacy officer, classifying your data, knowing what data you have and what you don't have, all of those things. That's what insurance is going to ask about. They're going to ask if you have an incident response plan. They're going to say, do you have Eric Shirk and Doug Herman's cell phone number on hand, ready to call them? And fortunately for me, the answer is yes. And I get to call them at all hours of the evening. Because data security incidents and data breaches happen in the middle of the night, early in the morning, and it's pretty exciting stuff. So they want to know if you've got a plan, incident response plan. So here's what the data says on reducing cybersecurity risks. And there's another meme. I declare a data breach. I always counsel clients not to use the word data breach until you know it's a data breach, because data breach means something. So I often get a call, I've had a data breach. No, you haven't. You've had a data security incident. We'll figure out if it's a data breach later on. So this is what IBM says. This is not what I say. This is what the data says. So stress test your incident response plan. So ask Doug and Eric to do a tabletop exercise to see how your response plan holds up under the real deal. And what we find there is, it seems almost silly, right? Like, well, let's pretend a data breach happened and figure it. Well, once you start pretending that a data breach has happened, you find out a lot of holes in your response plan. Like, for instance, almost 9 times out of 10, there isn't a phone number to call in the response plan, right? They're like, oh yeah, we've got an IT provider. Okay, what are you going to do? Email them now that your entire network's down due to ransomware? So, it's those little things.
Or Jason, also to throw this in, how many clients in a panic will notify lawyers, service providers of an incident via the email system that is likely compromised? So having the forethought to say that the systems that I'm using on a daily basis are likely compromised, and perhaps to manage this incident, we shouldn't use those. Those are the types of things that tabletops many times will ferret out.
And
That's
so,
a good
guys,
point.
just a quick note here. We need to move on to the last portion of the presentation. But before we do that, Jason, a great question came in about cybersecurity laws applicable to Michigan-based businesses. The request is basically, hey, can you share a link with us, or can you direct us as to where we can find some sort of comprehensive document that will outlaw what we have to worry about? Jason, is that something you can paste in the comments or something like that section before we finish up here?
I don't know if there is a comprehensive. I mean, there's really in Michigan. There's two data breach laws that that I'm generally three that I'm generally concerned about. Right. So one is the Michigan Data Breach Notification Statute, and there's all kinds of big law firms have kind of done 50 state surveys, so you can Google, Michigan data privacy laws to find like a compendium. But I'm worried about the Michigan Data Breach Notification Law. I worry about the new DIFS cybersecurity law, and I think you can see it's the addition to Chapter 5 of the Insurance Code. And then I care about HIPAA. HIPAA is a federal law, and so it applies to all the states, right? And there is some interplay between the state law and the federal law, and HIPAA, kind of trumps sometimes. HIPAA gets pushed out some other times. It's a little bit of a legal analysis, but essentially I worry about HIPAA with respect to protected health information, and then with respect to just general personal information, I think about those two statutes. So those are kind of the big three. There's a Social Security number privacy policy in Michigan, and some other smaller ones. But here's the Michigan new DIFS law, and the new DIFS law applies, like I said, to basically insurance companies, producers, agents that register their licensees with the Michigan Department of Insurance and Financial Services. And guess what they say? They say you need an information security program, a written one. And you need to classify your data. You need to think about your data. You need to care about it. And in fact, if you start looking at the list is long. You need to designate an employee. You need to identify reasonable threats. In fact, the list gets so long that I end up just wanting to do this, which is there it is. There's all your obligations to have your information security program. And so, it really boils down to these three things: implement a comprehensive written information security and compliance program, train your employees to that program, implement an IT security program, and place cyber liability insurance. And if I could take I've read a lot of HIPAA and high tech. I've read this new DIFS law that went into effect January 20th, 2021. I've read that several times. In fact, I've got it right here. I've read all this stuff, and it becomes mind-numbing, right? I mean, if you go back to my slide here, is like, what would you say an information security manager does? And what these laws try to do is put a list of all the best practices together that lawyers and IT experts have put together over time, and basically list them out and say, this is what you need to do. And what's intense about this new DIFS law, right, is that starting February 15th, 2022, so basically in a year, you need to certify 2 DIFs of your cybersecurity event. And so, this is where the kind of the rubber meets the road, I would say, for a lot of the folks, a lot of the Michigan entities on this call is, I get a lot of this, well, do I have to do all this stuff? What do I have to do? What do I really have to do? And now here's what DIFS has to say. DIFS says, okay, now you have to do it, and you have to certify to it. And if you have an event, you've got to send our agency the notice. And if you determine that there has been a cybersecurity event as defined under this law, if you scroll down, you have to ship them a copy of your privacy policy.
Jason, apologies. As much as I love looking at paperwork and everything like that, we've got about 10 minutes left, actually about 9 minutes left. And I know you wanted to get on with that. Don't mean to redirect your excellent advice, but at the same time, I don't want to run out of time for the audience.
Well, Doug, I would expect nothing less out of you being the moderator here. So I guess, the bottom line here is we've Miller Johnson and Microvisions, we've been dealing with this stuff for years and years, and things are finally starting to mature in the cybersecurity space, right? So we're seeing laws mature. We're seeing best practices mature. We're seeing data breach response best practices mature. And I guess what we've tried to do here is, put together a system for our own clients. And we're like, we put together a system for our own clients so many times that we thought we'd share it kind of with the rest of the world. And what it is FortifiedCyberDefense.com. And it provides enterprise level cybersecurity fundamentals for small to medium-sized businesses in an affordable monthly subscription with a simple web-based onboarding process, right? So that's what it is. And essentially, what you do here, maybe I'll flip over to the website. So we'll go back. I wanted to look at more forms personally, but Doug wants to look at the website. So we'll look at.
No, I love the forms, Jason. You make me fill them out, so
Well, those attestations are what my clients stay up at night worrying about, and that's what I worry about too. Is if I have to attest to somebody that I'm doing something, then you actually have to be doing it. So many clients are like, send me your information security policy, and I'll put it in a binder on the shelf, and then I'll never look at it again. So here's Fortified, right? So we put together this web-based program where basically you just choose your level of protection, you answer some basic questions about your business, and you get 12 months of cyber protection. It basically was born out of this idea that I was kind of tired of having the same conversation over and over again with Sam, right? Okay, Sam, I've got a client. They've had this thing happen, or they're interested in improving their cybersecurity posture. Can you give them the basic IT stuff that they should be doing? I've got their information security policies and procedures all under wrap. Can you please help them out? And then I would call a third party. I would call the insurance company, and I would say, all right, I've got a client. They need to get their act together. They need to place insurance, or the insurance they have is awful, or all the insurance they have is third-party liability coverage, and really what they need is first-party liability coverage, which will cover those things that we saw in the IBM report are actually the cost of data breaches. It's rare that you have litigation arising out of a data breach. It's not rare to have to hire a forensic IT firm to tell your attorneys whether there's actually been a breach. So we've got 3 levels. I mean, we try to make this, in a sense, kind of the, a very Amazon.com kind of experience of signing up and getting information security policies and procedures, getting essential security practices, getting network scanning and reporting, and getting security awareness training. Now, if you see that 4th bullet there, I think is potentially the most important. The number 1 cause of data breaches is human error, right? I mean, human error across the spectrum. And so, we've basically taken all of the relationships that a data breach coach has developed over the years and kind of put together a proactive package such that, this will get you 90% of the way there. And it kind of lays on top of what you're already doing. It kind of assumes that you already have antivirus and malware, right? You're probably already going to have antivirus. You're probably already going to do, have some things that you're doing that, your IT person or your MSP are already doing. This kind of lays on top of that. And what it does is when you get the network scanning and reporting, you're going to get a report that tells you all about your vulnerabilities, you know, and it's going to tell you, you know, things that you need to know from an IT perspective to juice up what you're doing. And then, you know, down here with the cyber liability insurance, you know, given our experience, you know, $100,000 goes a long way, a long way to covering the costs that we're seeing. And, you know, what we're seeing right now too is a lot of people already have some sort of cyber liability insurance. And so this can be layered, you know, on top of that. And this has, you know, this has $1,000 deductible. So you don't have to plow through your first 35 grand to get to coverage. It's just there for you. So, you know, that's Fortified Cyber Defense in a nutshell. And you can kind of, if I scroll down here, you can kind of see, you know, what we've tried to do really is take the friction out, and because no one wants to call a lawyer and create a new relationship. I mean, that's been my experience. And then call an insurance provider, create a new relationship, call an IT service provider, create a new relationship. You know, we've kind of taken that process and shrunk it down into this, you know, into the fundamentals here. And we're excited about it. So this is new, and it's exciting, and we're hoping that, you know, it'll help people go from, you know, 0 to 60 in no time at all.
So Jason, as we sort of finish up here, we got a great question from the audience. So you sort of mentioned it a little bit ago, but there's a bunch of different groups that are involved in incident response, right? There's, you know, of course, the organization themselves and their in-house or third-party IT provider. There's going to be you from an attorney perspective, so that we wrap this in the cloak of privilege. There's going to be, you know, someone like Eric and I who is doing the actual incident response investigation. What happened? What was the point of attack? You know, was anything exfiltrated? Can you talk a little bit about, within the context of Fortified Cyber Defense, is that last component, the Eric and I of the world, is that included, or how is that covered by FCD?
As we developed this program, you know, this was the question we kept asking ourselves, right? Like, what can we do? Like, if you are going to have a simple process to follow, that you know, how can we create a high impact and effective program, taking into account, you know, kind of the realities of the situation, right? So incident response services are in there. You know, some of your hard, you know, I guess you would say your hard MSP work, your IT work, the network patching and reporting, firmware updates, endpoint protection. You know, a lot of this stuff is what we're finding, you know, a lot of it is either already at our clients, they're already doing a lot of these things, and or, you know, it's a bigger lift, right? And so, you know, the Fortified Cyber Defense.com program is really designed to, like, small to medium-sized businesses that, you know, really just have no information security program. They may have these regulatory requirements now. It's to really give them this layer of protection that is a very soft touch, right? The rest of these require a bit more heavy lift.
Jason, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So, guys, we're right at time. I would like to thank the panel members, Jason, Sam, Eric. Thank you very much for the information today. And I'd also like to thank our audience. Spectacular questions, and hopefully we've gotten the bulk of them answered. Appreciate everyone's time today, and we'll look forward to chatting again sometime in the future.
Great. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you. Everybody have a good day.
Thanks.